recording. Just let me know when that's occurred, Michelle.
Okay. Okay, we are going live now. We
good?
Yes, we're live.
Okay, well, welcome all, and thank you for joining the April IAASB video conference meeting. I hope everyone has, which we provided the agenda papers for this video conference. As you know, as usual, we also post the notice of the meeting to the public and our agenda papers on the IAASB website. For today and tomorrow's meeting, with the small exception of a few minutes here and there, we expect full attendance by board members and PAs on this call, so that's great. We also welcome our public observers and those following us on the YouTube channel too. So our observers for the PIOB, Karen Stothers, welcome Karen, it's great to have you with us, and our official observers, Jim Dowkin, our CAG chair, and Yoshi Matsumoto from the Japan FSA. I also wanted to give a special welcome to a new member of the team, Amy Fairchild, who's joined us as a principal. She joined us from RSM. Amy will spend most of her time, but not all, on the LCE project. So great to have you on board. So Amy, if you just say hi, then people will be turned to your box and they can.
Well, thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. Really excited to be here and looking forward to working with you all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Amy, and welcome. For the call today, we will first focus on the CUSP project and the IAASB drafting conventions and guidelines. That's agenda item 1A. We're going to seek your views on the sort of the path forward and on the generally how the drafting conventions and guidelines have been put together. That'll take up for the first 2.5 hours of the call, and we'll break into executive session. Tomorrow's call is focused more on fraud. And so we will be focusing on the discussion paper, fraud and going concern and audit of financial statements, exploring, long title, exploring the differences between public perceptions about the role of the auditor and auditor's responsibilities in a financial statement audit. The working group on the fraud side is particularly interested in hearing your views on possible actions and whether there's anything further the working group should consider as it moves towards a project proposal. So with that, I pause for a second and see if there's anything else that the board would like to cover in these 2 days. Philly, anything to add before we turn to the topic?
No, Tom, nothing from me. I think we're ready to go.
Great. Okay. So we're going to turn to CUSP. Roger is going to lead us with us, but you know what we're going to try to do. There's 4 questions that the CUSP task force is asking us. We're first going to try to get your high-level views of the drafted principles and proposals, and then go into more specificity along the way. Just as context, this is what I actually think is more than a 2-pronged approach. I sort of view this as a 3-pronged approach of how to deal with issues of complexity. We're dealing with the LCE standard, we're dealing with CUSP, and remember, as our framework of activities as created the opportunity for narrow scope amendments too, when it addressed pain points related to complexity as well, that could be the topic of interest in our work plan consultation. So 3-pronged approach, 2 active projects underway. This session is focused on the CUSP working group. Again, we're very much focused on agenda paper 1A. And one of the things that we don't want this to be, at least as personally, is clarity Mark 2. I don't think there's much appetite out there. We have a lot of standards already changing. And so really, I think I personally view this as a go forward approach to dealing with complexity in our standards, improving the way we draft them. Roger, and he's going to be very much helped by the team. I turn it to you to lead us through our agenda papers.
Thanks very much, Tom, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. A good introduction there, Tom, and nice setup. So thank you very much. Again, thank you very much to the task force for all the work they've done, the working group, the work they've done, and especially the staff. It's been a coordination effort of trying to capture, all our knowledge on these drafting principles and consolidate them into the one document in that particular area. So thank you to all the staff who have participated. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit of background, especially for some of the new board members. December 2019, we received feedback from our discussion paper, and the feedback that we got there was that the issues that we are dealing with that are creating complexity and understandability issues are significant to all audits. They're not unique to audits of LCEs. So the determination was made by the board to go forward with two work streams. One which is the separate standard work stream on LCEs, and we've seen some drafts of that and how that's being proceeded. And the ISA-focused work stream, which is now called CUSP, which is really trying to deal with issues of complexity and understandability, scalability, proportionality within the entire suite of standards, how we can best approach that in those particular areas. So let's go forward here. Next slide. So here's some of the feedback that we received in those particular areas. Certainly, people are seeing that the length and volume of the ISAs are increasing. 540, over 100% increase in length, and 315, for example, are two of the individual standards where we heard quite a lot of feedback during the process, which we dealt with early in the process, which we dealt with. 315 probably had about a 50% increase in volume. So people are seeing that we are getting more granular in the way that we are writing the standards. We have received comments on the complexity of the language, which is adding to this. And the granularity or the level of prescription coming through. We also heard specifically that documentation or the detail required around documentation is something that is an issue especially for the less complex areas. There's other areas. So again, we are hearing this ecosystem, which is adding to the complexity. Which includes the complexity of our subject matter information and different regulatory pressures coming through. Next slide, please. So the proposed actions to address CUSP in this particular work stream is to develop drafting principles and guidelines, beneficial to the staff, empower the staff, part of the monitoring group approach to empower the staff in those particular areas so that they are aware of the drafting. And also, we keep on hearing around the board, challenges around the drafting and some of the drafting conventions, which haven't been clearly articulated or documented in the past. So the aims are to provide a common understanding of how ISAs are drafted, to try and promote consistency, clarity and uniformity, encourage a reflective mindset to make sure that we are dealing with issues of importance, and that we are appropriately dealing with issues. And not only are we getting the details right, but those details are clear. So, you know, to have effective standards, not only do we have to have the requirements right, but everybody has to, we have to communicate those requirements. So very much on the communication. So focus on how the ISAs are written and presented. Scalability and proportionality. We have heard very much specific issues, and we have into the document working propositions on how we are looking at scalability and proportionality, but they are very specific challenges and what we need to do in those particular areas. Remember, of course, as Tom said, I was going to go with the two-prong approach, but I like the three-prong approach, so we are dealing with this. Always think about this as, you know, what we're dealing with is the LCE standard. We do have the framework for activities, which does allow us to do quite a lot on how we update these standards, how we keep the standards current. So it is a good idea to think about this as the three-prong approach. So let's move to the next slide, please. So the intended users, as you can see, what we've got there is that we basically have a set of drafting principles and guidelines, and we think of staff as a primary audience in this particular regard. So it is helpful for the staff who are tasked with drafting these particular standards. Now, I know we as a board get into it, but it is the staff, and we have run this past staff. They've found it beneficial. They've had a lot of feedback into this particular area. But it's also useful to boards. So we know that as a board, we keep on getting confronted with specific drafting issues. And so the ability to refer back to these types of drafting conventions is beneficial to the board and to the task forces as they work through. It's also useful to national standard setters. In my role as a national standard setter, you know, what I want when I'm writing standards at the national level is to make sure that I don't change drafting conventions when I'm doing this. So the amount that we can convey to those and we can convey to translators is clearly what, you know, of benefit. So there are a number of groups that we see of that can benefit through this particular process on the communication. We don't ignore users either. So the extent to which we do this, anyone who is using our standards, of course, is going to be beneficial. So we've taken a lot into account, and we have a good staff with the clarity drafting conventions that we work through. I was on the board at that particular stage, 2003 to 2005. It seems like a lifetime ago for me. But the clarity drafting conventions were worked through, and the entire suite of standards was drafted in accordance with the clarity drafting conventions at that particular stage to ensure that the communication element of the standards was being achieved to the highest extent possible. We have been able to consolidate those. They were spread around different areas, knowledge. Some of it was in ISA 200, and some of it was in just different documents that was around. We have consolidated a lot of that information into the one place. We've looked at staff training materials and looked at internal thinking. For those on the board, they will know that when we got the comments on ISA 315, for example, we were challenged on the complexity and understandability of 315. And there was a lot of work done and a lot of thought process went through 315 as to how they would deal with those particular areas. 540 as well. 315 probably had a more systematic approach to dealing with those. So there's been some presentation tools which have been developed within 315, which have been used in some places and have not been used in others. And so again, we can see those areas. Scalability and proportionality changes, we have been challenged with. Again, we keep on hearing this. As we get more granular, as we get more detailed, as our standards get longer, the wording, the concerns get louder in this particular area. And so we do need to look at those particular areas. And we've looked at other information sources, other people who write standards to see what they have, other areas of the national standard setters. We reached out to national standard setters to see what details they have at that particular area. So we have collected and consolidated a lot of that thought process into this particular one document. Slide, please.
Roger, just before we move on, do you mind if I just add in a short comment?
I'm very happy with the staff to come in here because their staff have done a lot of work. So both Bev, Kalina and Brett, please come in at the correct stage. Please go, Brett.
Thanks, Roger, and Nikki as well, of course, who's been helping us out a great deal. I just wanted to come in here just to make a couple of observations about the content in this document. Much of the work in here, a lot of the great thinking has come from the CUSP working group. They've been particularly focused on that complexity, understandability, scalability, proportionality. We have also taken advantage of the opportunity to incorporate into this document a lot of material that's been used for internal staff training purposes. We had an internal drafting guide that we share with board members when you start, but I'm willing to bet it's not something that's necessarily front and center in your minds. But from our staff point of view, we've always had this challenge of when we're onboarding new people, how to communicate some of the lessons learned about how to write these things. And some of it is very detailed. So for example, there's some material about footnotes that goes into quite a lot of details about what we do and don't put in footnotes. Now, I appreciate that that's well beneath the board's notice. Nevertheless, we wanted to take the opportunity to put all of this in one space because it really does give the staff an excellent training tool and also something that they can use. The internal guidance that we've included in here includes a lot of the common things that we find when we're working through standards. So, usually most of what you see has been reviewed at some in greater or lesser amounts of details by senior staff. And so we really wanted to take a lot of that thinking and work it into this document as we went through it. So hopefully what we've got in here includes answers to some of the common drafting problems that we've encountered over the years, a lot of which relate to the complexity, understandability points, but also going a little bit further. I did want to acknowledge that the inclusion of all of this material makes the document longer, but length in this case is not a problem because nobody's going to be sitting here reading this document cover to cover. It is very much designed to be a document that you can dive in and out of based on the issues that you're facing on the day. So the length, particularly for me, is not of any particular concern. And I would be, obviously we don't want this thing to turn into 1,000 pages, but at the moment, I'm not particularly seeing that as an issue. So just as we go through this document, depending on where the question is, myself or one of the other staff may well come in just to, answer for it, because I do appreciate that some of this stuff is not driven by the CUSP working group. It's more of a staff initiative. So, we'll speak up where we need to. Thanks, Roger, and apologies for that interruption.
No need to apologise. Thanks, Brett, for that level of detail. And very much, again, you can see where the document is aimed at, where the benefits are, and the benefits for the board coming through on that too. Next slide, please. Okay, so the way that we have developed this is that we have distinguished high-level principles, drafting instructions about what to adhere to when drafting the ISA, and they are expected to be followed. And then we've got lots of guidelines, which is there, and as Brett has indicated here, This is a dig in and dig out type of document. So don't worry too much about the structure of the document. The expectation is that people will be able to access what they need to access for the issue that they are dealing with. The scope is that we have applied this in the context of the ISAs. So that is our brief. It doesn't mean that it cannot be applied to other documents, ISAEs, because they're good drafting guidelines, but we have applied in the context of ISAs, ISAEs, ISRSs, etc., ISQM. Can also, a lot of the drafting conventions and guidelines will come across as we think about how those things will be done. This is non-authoritative, so it is a principles and guidelines. It is more of a staff technical support material and board material. But staff are expected to follow the principles as they do the drafting. And the first point, if deviations from these principles are identified, discuss those with senior staff, and then bring those to the board via the issues paper, which is the current practice that we have. So we just haven't really articulated that practice probably in this level of detail. If there are deviations from drafting principles, then that should be brought to the attention of the board, and that will be done via the issues paper. Structure of the document, next slide, please. You've had a chance to look through it. The next two slides will take us through exactly what was the structure of the document. Don't get too worried about the structure of the document. We can argue around the structure of the document. There might be better ways. The major thing is to be able to access the areas you want. There is effectively a number of introductory sections at the front, which cover some of the major issues. Then we get into the structure of the ISAs. Next slide, please. And it takes us through some drafting principles related to the specific sections of the ISAs. And then we have some sections down the back on specific considerations. So we believe that we've covered it. We want to hear if there's other things that we should be covering in that particular area, so that will be important feedback. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of the outreach. So our outreach program will include the question as to whether the drafting principles or guidelines should be applied to the extent. We've heard Tom's view. We have, as we've talked about this as a board, we have talked about this not being Clarity Mark II. The board does not have the capacity to go. That was a long process. It took a number of years. The board does not have the capacity to go back in those particular areas, is my extent. But we still need to get the board to, even though we have indicated that, we still need to get the board to indicate exactly what that means for, that they're not expecting to see Clarity Mark II. That means that we're not going to go back and try and second guess these particular areas. It may give us a concern, and we need to address that particular concern about having drafting principles and possibly something in place that is not necessarily fully in line with the drafting principles. So we'll need to identify how best to handle that going forward. Drafting principles and guidelines to be updated from time to time with the revised and new content. This will be a document which we keep up to date. If we identify there are areas that we need further guidance on, we can update this particular document. So this will be a living, breathing document in that particular regard. Next slide, please. Okay, we need to get some feedback from you. We have question 1 and question 2, and we're going to take these separately. Question 2 gets into more specific elements So if you can save your comments for those specific elements on question 2, that would be good. There are areas where we need just some guidance from the board on what we include in these particular areas. But question 1, we're asking for your comments. First time you've seen this, does it hit the mark? Is there, in particular, is there anything which we're missing in that regard? So please, I understand detailed comments feed us back, but first time you've seen it, so let's have a look and see whether or not this hits the mark for dealing with the issues that we are dealing with, and give us those feedback. So with that, Tom, I'll pass that back to you so that we can get the feedback from the board.
Okay, question 1 is really aimed about general views. So let's target that. Lynn?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much, Roger. I found this paper extremely useful. I think it does hit the mark. I did have a question about what the staff thought about it, but Brett has nicely covered that off. So my overall comment is well done. I think it's going to be useful, and I think the right setting is to work from here forward using these principles and guidelines rather than going backwards. So appreciate that. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Lynn. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. And Roger, same as Lynn. I appreciate the time you spent explaining the paper and what the group has been doing. I'm very comfortable with the direction of the project. I think it's important to have those elements in terms of consistency, because definitely the changes over the last couple of standards have gone in different directions. People are asking outside why 315 was drafted the way it was presented and the others are not. And of course, that kind of inconsistency brings the question of whether or not we should try to standardize the whole process. I cannot really say that we have all the principles. I think this is going to be a project that needs to evolve with time. This is just probably step 1, where we are going to say here are 10 or 15 principles that we should follow. And as the project really goes live and we start presenting the documents, we're going to hear feedback from different stakeholders, and that feedback could probably delete some of the principles, maybe revise them, or add new considerations that were not taken into account because we probably did not consider them to be relevant. But definitely it's a good start. I think if we really want to help practice, the way the standards are presented should be very simple.
I've lost sound. Fernando, we've lost you from a sound standpoint.
Are you hearing me now?
Now we are.
Okay, so I don't know what I said at the end that was heard by everyone.
You said you loved it, but I
lost.
But you did say we'll have to take sound-ins from our stakeholders and maybe adapt along the way. And my sense is because it's not an authoritative document,
yes,
that it's more treated as a living document over time, right?
Exactly. And so I guess in general terms, supportive of the project, and let's see what others have to say, and then just have a positive vote to start dealing with these drafting conventions. Thanks.
Thanks, Fernando. When everyone goes on mute, I'm just going to interpret what I want to hear you to say. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much, Roger, for your explanation. It's very helpful. And first of all, I strongly support this project as I think it is very, very helpful, especially for non-native English speaking countries that need translation. And I support the proposed drafting principle and the guideline. I think it includes a lot of very helpful principles and guidance, such as not to use long sentence and complex grammatical structures with relative pronouns, as well as not to include unnecessary materials. The issue of long sentence and the complex grammatical structure is that it may raise different interpretations for the same sentence. And it will prevent the standards from being applied consistently all over the world. And unnecessary materials not only obscure key messages, but also add unnecessary translation burden. So I think these issues are very, very important to be addressed, and I therefore strongly support this direction. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom, and good evening, and thank you, Roger, and thanks the team and the staff for preparing all these documents. At an overarching level, I very much support the proposed drafting principles and guidelines. The one method that I do believe could be added is the principle of think small first. That is, the requirements should be designed to deal with the smallest entities, subject to audit and requirements to deal with increasing complexity, or to be introduced thereafter using conditional requirements. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Kai. Josephine.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thanks to obviously the task force and the staff for all the hard work. Similarly, very well received in my camp. Excellent start. Thank you very much. A couple of things on the paper overall. I actually think achieving the objective of this project, which was ultimately to deal with the complexity, the understandability, etc., is probably in your principles and guidelines in section 2 and 3. And I think those, to me, are more the foundation when you're thinking as well about how you're drafting a requirement. So that doesn't come through. I mean, that may be obvious to some, but it doesn't come through as obviously to me. So I wondered if we could somehow make a better connection between that being what's the foundation to anything you're drafting in terms of section 2 and 3, and then the rest will follow, like how you actually have to describe a requirement in the shall. And it just generally, when we're looking at the proposed drafting principles and guidelines, if we could repeat the language that's used in 200 as far as possible. In some cases, I've noted where it wasn't quite the same. We probably should just stick to what we have in the IASB already, unless we want to change that, then that's a different thing, different conversation. So, and I'll pass all this on, of course. There were a few instances where I saw comments in the drafting guidance, which I actually thought ought to be principles. And for example, the key principle behind the objective is around the aim, but that's not particularly clear from the drafting principles in that section. So again, I'll send all this along. The examples were really helpful, particularly where, you know, we've probably not got it quite right there, and we really ought to rethink how we should write that in the future. So, and a good example to include might be where something is educational material and it really ought not to be in the ISO and the standard, for example. But you won't be surprised to hear my favourite topic, scalability, proportionality, conditionality. Roger's already smiling. I think we're really nearly there, but we're not quite there from my perspective. I think we are actually mixing up some of those. I think we're mixing up relevance with proportionality and scalability. So instead of covering that now, I thought I'd just send you along what my thinking is, and maybe we can have a chat about that. But, you know, it's things around, just to give you a bit of a flavour, you know, 610, for example, is simply not relevant. It's not a proportionality matter. It's, you know, do you have an internal audit function or not? But the individual requirements in 610, of course, have to be tested for proportionality. And so, but there are other ISAs where we do think about proportionality. And just on that, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just on that, I think with proportionality, I do see, yes, as you say, rightly so, you do have to think of an ISA as a whole and whether it's proportionate in the circumstances. But what's really, really important when we're drafting requirements is proportionality at that requirement or that measure level. So I think for those principles, we really need the, the umbrella ISA and also at the requirement level as well. So just expand on those. And yeah, that's really all I wanted to mention on it overall. A fantastic start. Really excited about these drafting principles and looking forward to the next stages. Thank you.
Thank you. So I said at the outset, one or two board members would have to be away from the meeting for a little bit. Julie is out right now, and Tanya is going to share Julie's comments in her absence. Tanya?
Yes, thank you, Tom. I want to preface this by saying I am on the task force, so I have a little bit of a dual hat here, and I'm sure Julie would thank the task force and Roger. One of the comments that she wanted me to pass along was the proposal for focusing on applying these principles and guidelines on a prospective basis. She was wondering whether maybe we should consider, during some of the previous public feedback that we received, some folks had identified some standards which were, potentially more problematic than others in terms of understandability and complexity, and that maybe we should consider whether we should, look at, a handful of standards prior to when they're on the schedule to be opened up, because it may take some time. We do have, a long work plan. We have a number of standards that are active currently, but it may take some time to get to some of the other ones that we aren't working on. And so just kind of considering from the feedback that we received, which ones are more difficult, and if we are not, we don't have that on our schedule for this foreseeable future, to consider maybe looking at some of those sooner. Thank you.
Thank you. I almost think that sort of falls under some of the potential one form narrow scope amendments. Maybe it's a little bit more than that. Of course, the biggest issue will be constraints on staff resources right now and board time. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. First of all, very supportive of this. I think this is a great work product, and I think it'll drive consistency and clarity. And so I'm very, very much supportive of it. The one comment that I had was a little bit about structure. And what I mean by that, when I take a step back and I think about the ISAs, and I think that we've got the front section, I'll call it, of the ISA, which is the standard. And then we go into the application material, and then we might go into an appendix, and then there might be implementation guidance. I know ISA 200 paragraph A61 does talk a little bit about what should go into an application material, but I thought maybe just in your drafting principles, it might be an opportunity to tighten up exactly what goes into what section and what is appropriate in each section. And the reason I bring that up is from a practitioner standpoint. When I go to look at a standard, I'm always curious. I want to focus on, this is the standard and this is implementation guidance. This is maybe a little less authoritative. This is an interpretation. This might have examples. This might be, again, interpretation. And I just think sometimes I guess I was expecting in these drafting principles to have some reinforcement or guidance about what types of material goes into the standard, what goes into the application material, what goes into the appendix, and then what type of material is appropriate in implementation guidance. And I think that might also help address the risk of maybe putting too much information into the standard. And I just throw that out. Obviously, you folks are much more expert and much more experienced in this, but that was just my only comment or suggestion that I had. Overall, though, again, I thought it was very good and very well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks, and thanks, Roger and the task force. Like others, I think this is really good material. The kind of high-level principles and guidelines, I think look sensible. We've sent some detailed comments offline. Like Roger, I was involved in the Clarity project, although at the receiving end of it. And it's interesting to reflect on how some of the quite clear principles that were established at the time have eroded over time. And I think what's really important with this exercise is that we embed them into the practice throughout the organisation. And I've highlighted in the comments we sent, there are certain sections I felt were really valuable, not just from a staff perspective, but from a board perspective when we're providing comments and setting expectations. And perhaps as we're setting up task forces to really remind people of some of the goals and objectives there. So there may be an element of perhaps structuring so that you've got things that are particularly relevant for the board as well as for the staff. Like Julie, I had observations on the prospective application. I fully appreciate that we don't have the resource and it's not a priority to go through a full kind of clarity exercise. But I do have a concern that maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, when the background for this project has perhaps been lost, and we have a number of standards that have been written under the new guidelines, it may be will be confusing in practice to interpret that. And I thought the suggestion that you had about whether there are some limited amendments or something like that would be good to look at how we can maybe address that potential confusion going forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Kai Morten?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to Roger and the task force and the staff that's worked on this project. Similar to what's been expressed by the others, I really like the direction of what's being done here. Looking back at the input we got on the consultation we had almost 2 years ago now, there are great expectations to what this project will do. And I think a lot of the content that is here would help not only drafting the standards, but also for translation or the use of the standard, and thinking especially about when we have the verbs and the describing the work efforts. I think that's essential, having that knowledge, both as a reader of the standard and auditor, or translating it to know what the expectation is. And I think maybe having clarity around some of that could relieve some of the pressure on the documentation as well, because I think some of it may come around the unclarity on what's expected of me in certain areas. Similar to what Diane expressed, I would have liked to have some more direction on what should go in the different areas, so meaning what should be requirements and what should be application materials and examples and so on. I think that some of the feedback that we're getting is that the application material is getting longer and longer and addressing almost every possible situation. And I think during the last weeks or last days of approving a standard, we add in a lot of application material for certain circumstances. So more clarity around what exactly should be an application material and what should not be there, I think is essential to have in this document as well. I think the other thing, it's there, but it's a bit vague. I think some of the things that we do when we're revising one standard is that we look at that standard more or less in isolation from the other standards, and we tend to bring in a lot of either bring in a lot of content or reference or cross-reference to other ISAs, which makes it difficult to read, and I think also more complex to use in general. But overall, I really much like the direction that we're going, but I think there are some areas that we need to tighten up a bit, but I think we're getting there. Thanks.
Thank you. Len?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Roger, and the working group members and staff. Like others, very good work done so far, very supportive, a lot of good materials, very supportive of the drafting principle and guidelines. A couple of comments, maybe others have already mentioned. One is the proportionality. I think Josephine talked about maybe how we define proportionality in paragraph 5 in the issues paper. The nature and circumstances, I think seems to be missing from that definition. So we'll send some offline comments as well to address that. The other one is, I think, Dan's comments about some clarity in terms of what needs to be in the requirement, application material, and guidances. I think that's similar comments. But one other comment maybe others might have mentioned is also I fully support the decision not to amend the standards retrospectively. But I was wondering whether we need to take out ISO 200 and take a look, because that's such important standards. Realizing that the resource and issues on the staff. So I'm not asking for any commitment, but as we go along the project, with just look at the ISO 200 to see if there's anything that we need to think about making changes. Then lastly, I was also at the Clarity project more than 10 years ago at the other side of the table. I'm just wondering whether maybe you have already done that as a working group. There was a number of regulatory comments at that time when IAASB was considering about the drafting conventions. So I would suggest perhaps take out some of those comments, some of the principles. I think it's very important, at least from the regulatory community. Of course, the time has changed, but regulators also contribute to the length and complexity of the standards. But it's also important to focus on what they said, more than 10 years ago, in terms of the focus on what needs to be done in terms of clarifying standards and how the standards should be written. So perhaps let's go back to some of the regulatory letters from the Clarity projects, because I feel that some of the regulators might comment on the drafting principle and convention this time around. So just make sure we're prepared and also engage them in the discussion, in the process. So thank you, Roger, very supportive, and appreciate what you have done so far.
Yeah, hi, Chun Wei. Thank you, Len.
Thank you very much, Tom. A very good morning from Singapore. So thank you, Roger, working group, and staff for the tremendous work done. Very supportive of this project. And I think from stakeholders, a lot of expectations in terms of what will come out of this project. I'm really delighted to see the draft in front of me, the drafting convention, principle, and guideline. I think through many of the board discussion, task force discussion, we always seem to point to this mysterious document that's somewhere, or just living in someone's mind. And it's really good to have this in front of us, and I truly believe that it will help us going forward in terms of providing feedback and the drafting and so on. I guess just my comment will echo some of the comments already made, but just going back in time a little bit to the Clarity project, I was in receiving end, and like many others, I'm a big fan of that Clarity project and what came out of it. And just looking at this document, I know that the Clarity project drafting convention was the basis, and I did not do a lot of investigation, but I guess one of the questions that our stakeholders would have is, what have we added to the document? So what we had with the Clarity convention, what have we added to that? And just looking at, for example, paragraph 9 to the issues paper, all those principles, is there anything that's incremental? And it might be helpful to just understand that a little bit better. And also the point that Sue made about erosion. I think post-Clarity project, while we were very happy with what came out of that project, subsequent revisions, have we adhered strictly to those conventions set out? And if not, what happened along the way? And how do we ensure that the same forgetfulness does not happen with this new drafting convention? And I think, Roger, in one of your earlier slides, you referred to the respondents' feedback relating to CUSP, and there are things like complex language, prescription versus principles, regulatory pressures, and so on. And those things, I'm sure, were thought of and addressed as part of the Clarity project as well. And it's a little bit like, decluttering at home. After a year or two, all the junk start accumulating again. So I guess, just to make sure that when we go through this whole process, we don't sort of revert to, cluttering all over again. So that's I guess, overall philosophy that we need to be mindful of. And just looking at the drafting convention, the part on proportionality and scalability, and that got me a bit thinking a little bit, because I was looking at it, and I think what we are capturing there all make a lot of sense and are all very, very helpful. But these are really current practice. I think we're already doing a lot of these things, especially in the recent projects. And I guess, given, again, all the feedback that we've received about the current suite of standards not meeting the user's expectation, how would doing more of the same actually help that? And I think just looking at principles and guidelines, I like a lot of the examples that's being given, but we're giving examples of what has been done right. And maybe we could draw a little bit more of the negative examples of what perhaps were not done perfectly well and how we can maybe improve them. And that will help us understand a little bit more about going forward, how we're going to improve the whole drafting and the process. And I want to also support what Julie and Sue and some others raised about that retrospective way of doing things and perhaps the limited scope edits that we might want to think about. So I'll just leave us at that. Thank you again, Roger and team.
So you raise an interesting point, but on how we could ensure that we live by these principles. I think my philosophy on that is I'm looking at how we could fulfill these principles. It's our accountability. Once we adopt something, to stick to it. And my observations is complexity is added by the board members, particularly at the end stage of projects when we're trying to satisfy particular needs. And, to some extent, we may need sort of a scout team that demands that we're adhering to our principles going forward once we put these into force. But there is accountability will be shared amongst us, and we will need to ensure that I don't see anyone else to hold us to account other than ourselves as it relates to whatever CUSP principles we approve. I know James was really involved with Clarity, and he's been raising his hand, so I'm going to call on James, and Joey, you could respond to me if you want afterward.
Thank you, Tom. Having spent, I don't want to even tell you how many hours on the Clarity project, I just had two comments I wanted to share. I'm very and really impressed with how well this document adheres to the Clarity spirit, brings it to life, respects it, and carries it forward. So I think none of what is being proposed, and it would be helpful just to make sure we identify if there is any divergences, but I think this really respects that piece of work and carries it forward. So I'm comfortable that we've not created new, but just revisited and improved upon what was globally agreed several years ago. The most important point, and I think I just want to share a bit of experience, is you know, during the Clarity project, it's pretty easy taking something you've already got that's been in existence for, you know, 5-6 years, and then taking away and scrubbing it, making it tighter, cleaner, crisper, etc. And what happens, and we talk about eroding of the principles. I don't know if the application of the principles, but the reality is when we are creating new concepts, we're breaking new territory on new standards, new requirements, new concepts. That creates anxiety of whether we've said enough. Have we explained it enough? Have we given enough examples? We're very concerned that it might not be understood. There might be confusion, and we add and add. And the critical question, and I've heard it a couple of times, is what's necessary and what's not necessary. Super hard to nail down on a new or a revised standard. That is where the bulk of, you look at the section on introduction, 2.2.2. That's where the elaborations really come in on new standards. In the application material, we are we are very concerned about communicating what we think. So what I'm maybe suggesting, and that's where we're going to continue to have the tension between board and staff and the principals. And the way I look at it and my experience in the Clarity project is to challenge what you write. And you say, will this application material, background material, contextual, do I need it in 3 years' time? When the world is familiar with these requirements, when we're comfortable. And if we can look back and imagine the durability of the standard, and in 3 and 5 years, are readers going to skip over that material because they understand it and they look for what is of continuing relevance? That will, I think, will be the most difficult challenge, especially as we develop new standards. So maybe there's a principle is challenge whether this is something that we need in the standards in 3 years, or we're trying to communicate what this new concept is about. And I believe that fits better perhaps in application material, communicative material, training material elsewhere. So I believe that will be and I'd like to see captured perhaps within the document as a principle. And that's a stand back to say this standard, I don't have to look at it and tighten it up in 3 years. I've got the essentials here, and all of the rest that is good for introduction of the standard is placed elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Edo?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Let's see. I first want to express my appreciation for Roger, the working group, the staff, for the issues paper and the drafting principles and guidelines document. I read it with great interest, and I agree with pretty much everybody else that this is a good piece of work that will be useful for future standards. I did struggle a little bit with proportionality and scalability in the issues paper, and I guess we'll address that later in the meeting. But I was also left with a bit of a niggle, is having letting these principles and guidelines sink in, whether this would make the difference in 315 and 540, where the complaints have, for example, arisen. And I had a little bit of so conditionality came in much more into that space. Well, the CUSP project was, or at least that's on the project page, addresses many of the same issues and challenges of the audits of LCEs. So I'm with Kai Uwe on this, and Chun-Wee also pointed to this a little bit. I do like the start from simple and build it up and work conditionality through the standards such that it hopefully can make a more tangible change. So that would be maybe a challenge for Roger and his team. The other area that I had that wanted to raise at this particular point in time is that I think it's great that the working group put provided the meaning of or articulated the work efforts and the words that we use in that context. I have some comments on those, but notwithstanding that, if we now put or articulate what evaluate means, or what take into account means, or what consider means, I struggle to see how that cannot be, or how that can only be applied prospectively. Well, these words need to mean the same thing in every standard. And particularly for those words, which are quite critical, I would expect, at least in that area, also some type of a narrow scope update where we scrub the existing standards for these words and align them with what we actually mean. And I can see some other narrow scope amendments as well coming out of this. So that were my overall thoughts. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you. Josh?
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate for the Roger and working groups. This paper is very readable for me, and I'm very supporting to this project, and I'm expecting the next stage of this project. And as mentioned, its project is essential for drafting standards, especially for the non-native speakers and non-native language speakers. But I have just one high-level comment. As shown by Roger, I understand that the 2019 board meeting acknowledged two work streams, including ISA and LC ISA. When this project is completed, the relationship between the ISA and the LC ISA seems to be unclear, because the ISA with scalability and proportionality and the LC ISA with scalability will be coexistent. I would like that working group should explain the position of the LC ISA with respect to the ISA with CUSP, particularly in terms of reasonable assurance. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you. Imran?
Thank you, and good evening from Johannesburg. I wanted to weigh in on this conversation, but first, having heard what others had to say, so know where to position this. And I've only just completed reading the papers, and I've been thinking through what the implications of it are for me in my day job as a standard setter, for us as a board, and for those who use our standards. And I couldn't help but feel when I got to the end of it that I had stumbled on something that was a treasure chest of sorts. You know what a treasure chest is like? It's something that was lost to you for a long time. It took you an even longer time to find it. And then when you find it, it really sparkles. And there is really some parts of this which were sparkling to me because it made a lot of things clear. Having done that, I recognize that I learned quite a bit from the experience, so much so that I think I must put it into my CPD register, a couple of hours of learning that has taken place here. But Roger triggered something in his opening comment this evening when he said that what we sought to do as a task group was to capture all our knowledge of drafting principles. I think those were his exact words. And I think that in 50 pages, we've been very successful in that. We've captured all of it. And through the collective wisdom of the 18 board members, there may be a few missing bits that you'll get, and the 50 pages will become 55 pages. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, then what? Some board members before me have talked about whether this leads to a thing like the Clarity Project again, and I'm not a supporter of the idea, but maybe what's the alternative? I think for me, the idea comes from the challenge is, how do we extract value from what we're doing in order to make our outputs simpler? And so, for example, I was thinking about what we've learned from it. If you now know that there are 7 types of occurrence in the ISAs, or that there are 7 descriptions of work effort in the ISAs, then doesn't it mean we have a problem? the fact that we've now documented it and we recognize it's this complex and it takes 3 pages to explain the 7 types of occurrence doesn't mean we have a problem. And does the challenge not come now that we have this treasure chest? How do we take those 7 and convert them into 3? Because isn't that what the practitioner wants from us? They want to know instantly, how can I understand all these multiple nuances in the language? And one way to make it simpler for them is not for us to use all 7, is to use less. And so, there's a low, middle, and high, whatever that is, or work effort is described in fewer words. And hence, as I heard Kai Uwe, Ido, and Chunwi say, I think they all spoke about, some kind of simplification that must come out of what it is that we're talking about today. So if the journey is about making things less complex and more understandable, I believe that the 50-page document is the halfway point of where we get to. I think what comes, and this is the question we ask high-level views, what comes after this? That how we use this encyclopedia of knowledge we've assembled that is so educational, now to say, okay, if it took 50 pages to write the rules, surely we need a shorter set of rules. And that's going to really make us CUSP. So that's my comment. I have been clear enough about it in the new tradition of CUSP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Karen.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to support the work that's been done and provide some general comments at this time. So, of course, continuous improvement is an admirable goal, and putting together principles and guidelines for drafting standards is important to get to consistent standards. But as the PIOB, we're very focused on, what are the key public interest issues, and when I reflect on what that is, I think it's about having high quality audit standards that lead to a high quality audit. And if this document is for drafting standards that lead to, simplicity and scalability, that's good if it leads to a high quality audit. And I just think we need to keep in mind what the main goal is here in the drafting of the standards. The other thing I wanted to say is over the last few years, a number of standards have been redone, or new standards have been put in place that were of key public interest. And when you're considering about whether you want to go back and look at those standards that have only recently been completed and are either just implemented or on the point of being implemented, I would suggest that if you're going to put your resources to those projects, you do a very wide canvas to find out if there's support to redraft what was just done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks, Tom. And I just wanted to mention that the CAG has been consistently, this has been an issue that the CAG has consistently brought up, and that is simplification, if I could use that term. And so I think having this, what this task force is doing with the CUSP is in the right direction. I would caution about, which several other people have mentioned, and just keeping it simple so it doesn't become complex within itself. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, that was a long round, but I figured it, considering the saliency of the topic and the desire for a lot of people coming in, that we should take that long round in. So let me try to summarize it, and then there's a number of detailed responses that the task force could respond to as well. If I'm right, there's general support for the direction this is heading. More than just general, so strong support for the direction that we're heading in. And the hardest thing is getting things on on paper, and the task force done a really nice job getting the draft out for us to react to. 2, there does not seem much support for any form of clarity to approach on this redrafting of all standards retrospectively. However, that doesn't exclude the possibility that there's some form of improvements, narrow amendments when necessary, and there may be some pain points, and the work plan discussion may raise some of these issues as well. Also, if we were to make sure, Ado made a good point, if you're saying that these are the only words that you should be using, then we need to consider whether it needs to be scrubbed throughout our standards. So that's an open issue, I think, for consideration. There were a number of opportunities for further simplification. Indeed, I actually looked at the appendix and I said, why do we need 7 adverbs or adjectives to describe something? Wouldn't it be better to reduce them? Now, there may be a reason that we have 7, and they may all have different purposes, but as a non-auditor and more of a grammarian in this, I would sort of suggest that it must be a better way to consider, at least for consideration, and then that would have knock-on effects. But in general, I think we all could agree that writing things, regardless of whether English is your first language or not, in a simpler, more direct style, has to be a good thing for the consistent application of our standards. And that's really what this is all about. It's not just getting the substance right, it's to make sure that our standards could be applied in a consistent, high quality manner. So I think drafting matters a lot in that regard. And I'm really excited, particularly my big bugbear is the end of passive voice in our writing. So I'm on a mission on that. And even in Appendix 3, I do not view that as a possible outcome to resolve active verbs where they shouldn't be too active. Someone has to convince me why that's a bad thing to begin with, but expunging passive voice has to be good. Roger, I turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks to all the board members, and thanks, Tom. And I see that you got one of your pet issues in there, so well done into the summary. Look, I did take away strong support for the direction. I didn't note anything major missing. There's areas that we need to work on. We will work on scalability and proportionality. We thought we had dealt with them, but we have got comments, so please feed through details there. Josephine, I thought we'd hit the proportionality of requirements, but we will have a look back on that. I did get to the sense that we've covered it in a degree on the fact that this isn't clarity marked 2. I think we've got support from the board on that. If I've missed that, or if somebody is not doing that, but we do have the ability of continuous improvement with narrow scope amendments. And part of LCE, part of working with LCE is that also gives us the ability to test all these requirements for LCEs and identify narrow scope amendments. So as well as what we're doing with LCEs, working together, addressing those particular areas. We certainly have tried to distinguish between requirements, application material, and other material. But we will have a look and see if we can do a better job in that particular area, so that we can, give a better basis. I agree with those. For Karen's comments, we weren't critical. It was an observation of what's happened with the current standards. We weren't critical of what had gone through in the current standards, but we had observed there is no necessary push of opening up those current standards. They are there. But again, we will work on that on continuous processing. I think we've got a lot of anyone who can feed through any additional comments to look at. Certainly, we'll look at those. Brett or Kalina, anything I missed in those particular areas? Nikki, you want to come in?
Yeah, I might just come in briefly on one point. Certainly the question came up a little bit about how we've tried to separate what belongs in introductions versus what belongs in requirements, application material, appendices, implementation material. I can direct you to it. We have got it in the document. It's in each individual section though. But if I was to direct you to one particular point, if you read 10.1.4, which is under the heading of application material, we added one important piece. It's actually the last bullet in the list. And just to give you an example of how we've approached it, we've got some principles on this one, but as a guideline, we added in the idea that the presumption is that the reader is going to be a competent auditor, which automatically takes you into a space where you're not going to explain basic auditing principles. You're not going to explain basic accounting principles and requirements in the documents because you don't necessarily need that. You assume that they're subject to continuing education requirements. So we shouldn't, in our standards, need to be explaining things. And in the past, this has been an issue where the board has at times, talked about adding entire appendices to explain content. So I give this one to you, not because I'm seeking to get particular comments on that one, though we are, of course, interested. But just to give you an example of that's how we've dealt with it, by in each individual section, trying to give a steer as to what belongs in that section, rather than saying, here's content, where should that content belong? Instead, we've tried to say, these are the sections and this is what content belongs in each one. By inference, of course, whatever's left over is implementation support material, which is covered in large extent by the framework for activities and some of the material in there. I just wanted to add that little piece, Roger. So back to you, and Kalina and Nikki, of course, come in if you want to.
Okay, let's keep moving forward. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there's some areas of specific consideration, and some of the areas, the working group did not have a strong view on. So we need some comments because they have been raised in the board and they've been raised by staff on, please give me some areas in guidance. So the enhanced presentation approach through 315. Most of what we've got, especially the work that they did in 315 on trying to distinguish between requirements, application material, and other education material, I will call it, has been incorporated into the principles as Brett just outlined. I must agree. I'll use this to come in on James's point about new concepts. We do have an issue where we possibly overemphasize new concepts, and I think about spectrum of risk, as to a new concept and how do we best deal with that. We tend to, or there could be a tendency to over-educate on the concept of new, but there's not that many new concepts that we necessarily introduce on our way through standards. What we haven't incorporated from 315 is the column approach to requirements, where they've separated out the understanding from the doing, and boxes around examples. And there have been two issues that have been raised by the board again in those particular areas. So we would look for any specific areas as to which way to go in that particular area. We haven't incorporated, that's our view, but not a strong view. Specificity of references to international standards other than IAASB. And so we are looking for input there to specific areas, those as to benefit there, versus the issue of needing to read this body of other standards, such as the Iasb standards in total and understanding them in total, and the issue of maintenance. Again, for staff, the more that we are specific, every time there's a change in standards outside our control, we need to then update for those particular areas of change. So comments on those particular areas. Next slide, please. The appendices, and we did receive some comments on the appendices and drafting the draft aid for ISA development and drafting going forward. There's some good thought processes in those appendices. Remember, these are guidelines, and they're not exhaustive and not authoritative. Documentation, just to outline on documentation, we have been asked as to, this is an area of complexity, and as to areas of documentation, it is being dealt with a little bit under LCE, and we're looking to see what we can learn in those particular areas. And we are trying to deal with it. It's a separate focus area. We haven't really given you a lot of detail here. We are probably looking to see effectively, how 230 stands up, and where you add to 230 in specific areas, if we can provide some further guidance on writing the standards on 230 and writing. We have done some work. We haven't really incorporated a lot. It will come back. We are probably looking some sort of staff guidance in that particular area, which will go out there to inform people as to how we can work through on documentation, but we're also learning on LCE. So with that, we'll go to the next question. And Tom, I'm looking at the time here. We might start on this question if that's okay. Is that okay with you?
Let's start this question. I think it'll go faster than the last one.
Yeah, and so any specific comments, we're looking very specific feedback. So any specific comments you can give us in these, on any of those particular areas, open up for the board. Back to you, Tom.
Okay, question 2, it's in four sections, but looking for specific comments. Lynn?
Thank you, Tom. On question 2A, I particularly like boxes, and I would hate to have a hard rule that said we couldn't use them. I think they're particularly useful for examples, but there are others. And as a case in point, the guidance itself uses boxes extensively. So I don't have a strong opinion on it being around requirements. In fact, probably if I did have a strong opinion, it would be not to use boxes for that. But certainly for examples, and in some other cases, I think boxes are useful. In terms of the referencing to international standards, I think this should be used sparingly. Important to be used in some places, but to particularly avoid is cross-referencing backwards and forwards. That always adds complexity. I liked the appendices, but on occurrence and work effort, but on reflection of Imran's comments, maybe we can see if we can do some streamlining of that. And in terms of the documentation issue, I agree with basing it on 230 and only specific requirements in the other standards. This is an area that we have wasted an awful lot of board time on, discussing and going round and round in circles. So if we could resolve this, I think it will take out not only board time, but complexity for people. However, even if we do that, I suspect what users really want is just less documentation. They don't want to know more documentation. What they're really looking for is for us to reduce the amount of documentation. So I do think we need to question what's absolutely necessary in that area. And because I have to go in a second, can I just, on question number 4, add a sincere thank you one of my pet hates is in relation to, with regard to, etc., because they can always be replaced by a very short word. So I was delighted to see that and short sentences. And finally, I think we have to be really careful on 315 and 540 of doing any changes to them now, given that people are in the middle of implementation of them. So I just have a word of caution on that. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you. Josephine.
Thank you. I agree with Lynn. I really like the boxes and the tables, and that's actually consistent with the feedback I received. And what I heard was that they make the sections easier to navigate, particularly when identifying examples, and this makes it easier for practitioners to then navigate the standard altogether. And also with the requirements, they're useful in showing how some requirements actually work together or are comparable. So there was a plea to not remove the idea of the boxes. They thought that was a great new change to 315. I do recognise that some national standard setters may not be able to accommodate those locally, and that of course is fine, but for the purpose of our handbook, electronic or otherwise, we'd like to see those remain. On the references to specific paragraphs of international standards, I agree primarily with the comment that having those references is actually helpful for clarity and understandability. So I do recognise the code is integrated code, so the IASs, and I think we should just continue to liaise with Iasb to make sure that when we want to use an example, because we think it's important to highlight the ethical, the relevant ethical standard at that point, we just make sure that they're comfortable with what we're writing and that it hasn't somehow broken the principles behind the IASB code. On the appendices, dealing with likelihood of occurrence and work effort terms, I had the exact same thought as Imran on this. I think that we've got an opportunity here to streamline these terms rather than just keep continuing to use them. I mean, even when TK and I were talking about these, we were saying that some are just you know, mean the same thing, and we were coming up with different words ourselves. So even TK and I had different views on these. So where you land, I don't know, but please, going forward, let's just streamline them and maybe just use 3 going forward. And then in terms of the use of that horizontal spectrum actually caused a little bit of grief. For the purpose of just this particular meeting, it was quite useful to think of it in that way, but in terms of the actual work effort terms, it wasn't necessarily the case that if you use determine, it's a lot of work effort. It really depends on what it is you're determining in the circumstances. And whilst you might have remain alert at one end and you might have evaluate at the other, as I say, most people said or could choose examples where you wouldn't have to put a lot of work effort into it. So the important thing here is to actually describe what you're expecting when that verb is used, as opposed to try and plot them on a spectrum and then have everybody argue where exactly on the spectrum those lie. And in terms of the specific documentation requirements, individual standards, absolutely agree with the task force's direction on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Apologies for being late. Hello, everyone. Just some thoughts, some Roger on the pieces of question 2. Like others, I'm a fan of the boxes, so I would be sad to see them go. But I'm also open to the fact that if the working group has some views as to pros and cons, would be open to looking at that. So I guess I just didn't see enough of that. Let's say a pro and a con list to keeping them or not keeping them in the document. So I wasn't really swayed yet to remove them. My personal preference would be to keep them. And in ISQM1, we use some of that as well. So I guess I'm showing my bias there on my preference. For the references, Lynn mentioned using them sparingly. I would agree with that. But I think when we do use them, using them to specific paragraphs is the most helpful for the reader. I know myself, if I click on something and I go and I really just get the heading of some really long document as a reference, it's probably going to be one of the few times I go to that reference. So I think despite the maintenance of keeping them as specific references, I think to me the most helpful, they need to be specific and point to the various paragraphs we're hoping that people connect the dots with. On the appendices, I was struggling to see what the way forward with the appendices were. I appreciate that's a summary of where we are today, but like Josephine just described, I wasn't sure if we needed to have 7 ways, 7 ways of describing likelihood of occurrence and however many, I forget, ways of describing work effort. And to be honest, I read them very carefully, and a couple of them, I wasn't even sure if I could distinguish the difference. So I would really, we have the Iasb the way they are using all those terms, but I think going forward, it'd be really helpful if the working group could come up with a shorter list and distinguish between the terms that we have, because as I said, a fairly educated reader of the standards, I couldn't distinguish always between what we were saying there. And then I guess lastly, reflecting on the documentation piece, and I personally struggled with this one a little bit on my time on the board, which is we point to 230 as the documentation standard, but then we end up with specific documentation requirements in various ISAs. And it feels a little inconsistent to me, and I'm not sure how that happens. Is it a function of 230 isn't adequate, or is it a function of very specific items that we need to add? And I think a user of our standards could be confused by that as well. You need to add all these bits together to come up with whatever the full suite of documentation is. So I think any work we could do on that would be really helpful to the users of our standards. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thank you. Sachika.
Thank you. With regard to 2A 315, I support the working group proposal. I'm okay to use boxes in the application material for examples, but I do not support incorporating uses of box and tables in the requirement that are using 315 to this principle and guidelines. As a national standard setter, I would like to tell you that the JICPA is now finalizing the revision of our standard that is comparable to 315 in light of ISO 315 revised 2019. And although we use boxes in the application material and other explanatory material for examples, we do not use the boxes tables in the requirements section because we think it does not help alleviate the issue of complexity, and it may even raise unnecessary confusion. And with regard to B, reference to other standards, I think it is helpful to retain the references to international standard other than ISAs. I understand the issue of significant maintenance burden, but I think in some limited circumstances, the references to another standard are necessary for quality and understandability. So I prefer to retain them in limited circumstances. And with regard to C, appendices, I found these appendices are very helpful for consistent application of standard, particularly in the country that need translation. So I strongly support these appendices, but I also support reducing the wordings for future perspective, which are also, I think, very helpful. And D, documentation, I think this is also helpful because some may not understand the relationship between overall requirement in ISO 230 and other specific documentation requirements in other ISOs. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Relative to 2A, I'm with everybody. I like the boxes. I think it enhances the readability. So I'm for the boxes. And if there's some pretty negative or challenging aspects about doing that, just let us know. And so we have got the kind of a balanced scorecard here. But my personal preference is I like the boxes. when thinking about referencing to other standards, I think there's some that it might make sense being a little bit more helpful, in particular IASB, versus maybe just other auditing standards. So I think IASB in particular, there'd be a nice connection. But to Julie's point, I would ask that if we're going to go down that path, that it's a specific reference, so that's not just a click and then you've got to go search the document. So that might make it more burdensome than the benefit. Relative to C, same as everybody, I think there's an opportunity now that you see it in the broad light of day to maybe take a look back at these. I think the probability, how you define those, I think can be condensed down. I also think on the likelihood table, I was struggling with the word likelihood. Some of these things that were listed in the table struck me not necessarily as likelihood, so I was just questioning the use of that word. And then in the work effort verb, again, I'd have a challenge defending what's the difference between taking into account and considering. So I think, again, there's an opportunity to maybe skinny that down. D is the one that I struggle with. When I go and I read 230, I believe it is, when I look at that, it's all there. And it makes absolute sense. This is what you've got to document. A reasonable person has to be able to understand what the auditor did. You have to document your conclusions, document your planning. It's all there. However, when I now think about what I see and where our teams have challenges and where I've had challenges with my own teams, documentation is so fundamental. It is such a critical part of what the auditor does. It is so important that I personally feel like we can't say enough about what should be documented. So I will always err on the side of, I think 230 is there. It's the backbone. It's the foundation. It's absolute. But to the extent there are opportunities to reinforce documentation and the importance of it, I would err on the side of putting that in the additional individual ISAs. So those are my views. Thank you.
Thank you. At least for the first three, I see really common trends emerging here, that sort of general like of boxes, but caution on the use of them and the actual requirements. References to specific paragraphs should be rather limited, but not excluded. And the appendices, the way I describe it is, it's actually just brought front and center an issue that the board thinks that the working group, the task force should address, is why are we saying using 7 words to say maybe the same thing or 3 different things, and maybe there's an opportunity to explore reducing them. Is that a fair summary of the drawing consensus? I do that because I'm conscious of the time left, and when those who want to say something, if they're with the consensus, then it gives an ability to say it. We've had some different thoughts as it relates to D, so I don't want to short circuit that as well. Roger, you're the task force chair. Is that a fair summary so far?
Yeah, it's a fair summary of what we've heard so far, Tom. So okay. Yeah, so if there's any dissenting views to that,
right, that's what I was trying to get. If you agree with my summary with a position from A to C, just say I'm with the rest of the board on this. And then on D, obviously, share your thoughts. Okay, Kai Martin.
Thank you, Tom, and you made my job a bit easier. I'll just come in on A just to say that I do support the use of boxes and tables also in requirements. If you look at 315, the way it's done not for all requirements, but it's done where there are some conditionalities and to show the connection between them. And when we did them, being on the task force, it was to show that they are related, and trying to write them without using the tables, they become really, really complex and almost impossible to understand. So I do support using them in circumstances where it could really help the understandability and readability, but it's not the concept that should or could be even applied throughout on all requirements. On D, on documentation, I agree 230 should cover it all, but I think some of the feedback that we heard is that we tend to write the requirements not being specifically precise on what we expect, and they're a bit open-ended, so that both the auditors and inspectors, regulators, everyone can interpret or make their own interpretation of what the requirement really is asking, so that the auditor then has questions on what should I really document. So by addressing some of the other issues that we're doing in the CUSP project, being more precise on the requirement itself, I think we may also help on the documentation difficulties. But it's almost like something we need to consider as we draft the requirements as well. Is this something that even could be documented, and how would you think about it, so that we could have maybe in examples or something, implementation material potentially on how it can be done. Thanks.
Thanks. From one Kai to another.
Thanks, Tom. And indeed, Tom, that has been a fair summary of our discussion so far. So I make it also very, very briefly, beginning with little a. In my view, the use of boxes and tables to present the requirements and the use of boxes to separately identify the examples are a useful tool to aid navigation and understanding. To little b, to the extent that reference to specific paragraphs of international standards other than ISAs is appropriate and aids understanding, the IAASB should do so, even if there's a slightly greater maintenance effort. And to little c, I agree with the inclusion of the appendices with the likelihood of occurrence and work effort terms as a matter of principles, because it adds consistent application of terms in the ISAs. It ensures that the appropriate term for the likelihood of occurrence of work effort is used, assists readers in understanding the ISAs, and aids national standards in adoption, translation, and implementation. I do have some comments on the appendice. I will send them offline. And little d, I believe that attaching documentation consideration to use of words is a useful way to assist practitioners in documenting their work and to alleviate some of the differences of use on documentation between practitioners and audit regulators. All the other comments I sent offline, if you agree. Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thanks, Tom. And since it's the first time I'm speaking, I will say that this work product was really impressive and at the same time very enlightening for a new board member. With that, I am not going to pile on. I agree with the comments thus far in terms of the boxes. I am very visual, so it helps me when reading the standards. I agree on the international standards, or the references to other standards, it needs to be quite precise. And as I say that, it brings up something that was said earlier. I think it's important that we put some sort of standback convention into this drafting material, so that we are looking at things like this. Are some of the things that we've added in along the way really necessary? And then C, those were particularly enlightening. I did find the work effort verbs interesting, and then also caused me to think, do we really need all these? How different are they? And the last one, D, is an interesting one in terms of, I think about 230 should stand on its own, similar to some of the comments I've made in some other sessions about professional skepticism. Do we have to put that in every single standard? Isn't that a given? So I'm wondering if we should be thinking about maybe, I do remember something we did early on where there were little symbols that reminded you, here's where professional skepticism has to be applied. Here's where, or that there was a symbol for documentation as well. So something that might be simpler and then also gets to my what I like about things that are visual. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Sue.
Thanks. So I'm possibly an outlier on A. The outreach we did was finding the boxes and so on less useful. So I was comfortable with the task force recommendation. Agree with others on B and mainly on the appendices as well. In the comments we've sent through, I did ask a couple of questions in relation to documentation on some of the work effort pieces, particularly around consideration. So consider whether there's an expectation that documentation includes things that haven't been considered and the completeness of that. On the D and the documentation in general, I was comfortable with the task force position. Thanks.
Thank you. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom. Super quick. A to D, I agree with the rest and with how you have summarized. So that's easy. D as well, I think what the task force has included, the working group has included in the document, that's all very sensible, and I agree with those things. But maybe a little bit like Kai Morton, I think in practice, practitioners are still not certain as to the extent of documentation needed. There's still a lot of interpretation of, whether this is enough or not, and maybe we just need to do a little bit more to support people in the form of non-authoritative guidance or something. So I think agree, but maybe more needs to be done. Thanks.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. Also on the same page with A, in favor of the tables. It actually is one of the big selling points for 315 now during the implementation period. It's been well received, especially to explain how you can better understand the requirements and digest them. B and C, yes, in favor of what others have mentioned. And for D, I'm not against adding specific documentation requirements, but they should really be kept to a minimum. Otherwise, someone could imply that there's a gap in 230 that we're trying to fix by just adding a bunch of requirements. Thanks.
Thank you. Len.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Agree with the consensus view on A, B, and C. I just want to comment quickly on D. We have a live case going on at the moment with ISA 600. ISA 600 is built on a number of foundational standards where there are a number of documentation requirements in each foundational standard, in addition to ISA 230. This has been the biggest challenge in terms of the task force, in terms of trying to finalize ISA 600. So I agree with the principle and direction that the task force has taken. But I just want to air words of caution. I think the working group task force needs to stay focused while we try to achieve. I'm sure we're happy to share our 600 experience with you, but you're going to get a lot of different comments from different stakeholders. So I just want you to stay focused, and I'm looking forward to support what you do in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Okay, that completes the round. So I don't think that a great majority view has changed from where I said on A through C. Roger, you got some things to consider in terms of documentation. I turn it back to you.
No, thanks, Tom, and thanks very much to the board. That was fairly consistent feedback. In fact, a lot more consistent than probably the working group had expected. So, thank you very much. We'll proceed with A to C. Excuse me. Brett did want to say that the appendices, what you've got is an abbreviated list at the moment. the list that is used in the standards is a lot longer, but we will work on that. It gives us a basis for going forward, and I can hear the view of the board as to, okay, let's see if we can streamline this further. Don't use terms for the sake of using, the same work effort or the same threshold. Use different terms in that particular area. So that'll test us, and that will give us a focus for getting feedback. Documentation, Tom, is still a work in process. Nikki, in particular, is doing a lot of work in this particular area as to how we do go forward. We will certainly learn from 600. 600 is really complex in this area, Len, so I do sympathise with that, and I think we can learn a lot from your experiences, from the task force's experiences on 600 on actually as to how we best deal with that. But certainly the expectation is that we will produce something of a staff alert or something to once we land, once we work through appropriate processes, staff alert to get out there, because we realise this is a big issue in practice. Tom, with that, I'll pass back to you at the moment. I think we can do 3 and 4 fairly quickly after a break. So, yeah.
Okay. Brett, you have your hands up.
Yeah, if I could just jump in quickly. I just wanted to make one point, and Roger did touch on it. The appendices are already a streamlined version. And I just want to call out some of the excellent work that has been done by the staff in preparing these papers. I think one of the papers started with Phil, and then Bev did, a lot of heavy lifting, and we had a cast of thousands involved. Between Kalina and Nikki, they have prepared literally hundreds of pages of analysis of what's in the standards. And so we culled it quite viciously to get it down to this number. I do think when it comes to this question of streamlining the number of terms we use, it's very much part of what we're trying to achieve here. There is a little bit of a reality that when you've got different authors of documents, they tend to use their own lexicon. And so we're trying to eliminate, or at least align, some of that lexicon. I think in the probability one, the likelihood of occurrence appendix, there's obviously some very easy wins there. Equally in the work effort verbs, I know Bev has mentioned to me a couple of times that take it into account versus consider line is a particular problem area. I suspect we have a little bit of the same issue with determine versus evaluate in places. It does seem a little bit sometimes like a flip of the coin could put you on one side or the other, and that's probably not necessary from a standard setting point of view. But I did just want to make the point that please don't take away that what you're seeing in that in those appendices is a complete list, because there are far more terms that are used. And in fact, often we need those extra terms. So like even in probability, you may think it's sort of high, medium, low or something like that. But the reality is we need things that are towards the bottom end of the range, towards the top end of the range. Like we do need a lot of those terms. So I just want to set the expectations up that they're not all going to go away. But I think what we can do is take out some of that variability that just comes from different authors, and at least make sure that when we use a term, we always mean the same thing by it, and we don't have multiple terms with the same meaning, which I think is what this exercise has uncovered. Thanks for that.
Okay. I think it's time, even though the next section should go very quickly, I think we need a break. It's 5:52 p.m. my time. I suggest we take 5:53 now. Take reconvene at 5 minutes after the hour at 6:05, so 12-minute break. Okay, I'll see you back shortly. Thank you all. Okay, we'll start in under 2 minutes. Okay, so did everyone rejoin? Roger, I'm looking for you on my screen. Oh, here you are. Okay. Do you want to take us down the home stretch?
Home stretch, yeah. And thank you very much, Tom. And let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So looking for comments on way forward. So what we'll do is reflect on the comments we've heard so far, and we'll continue to do this. We will perform targeted outreach. We've got the National Standard Setters meeting coming up, and this will be an issue which will be presented to the National Standard Setters. And we'll look for other groups that we can meaningfully get some benefit from. So we're not trying to exclude anybody, but anyone who can give us some meaningful feedback on those particular areas, we will try to do. The documentation, we will further consider the actions. We'll certainly coordinate with 600. We'll certainly coordinate with the LCE group, as this has a close coordination with the LCE group as well. And the consideration at the moment is to develop high-level, non-authoritative, some staff guidance in this particular area. That's where we're going down. As we progress our thinking there, as we start to look at what we're developing there, Q&A or whatever it might be, we will keep the board informed in that particular regard. We will continue coordinating with LCE task force and the research and the outreach with the National Standard Setters, who again, are dealing with all of these issues. So we'll go forward to the next question, please. So let's cover off questions 3 and 4. Any comments on way forward? Any suggestions on what else we should be doing? And again, any views on anything that you haven't raised yet? So again, anything we haven't heard. We have heard your comments. We have heard some concerns around retrospective comments, and we'll work out how we can best deal with that from a due process perspective. But please, I'll turn it back to you, Tom, to get comments from the boards on questions 3 and 4.
Okay, any comments on way forward and any other topics for the working group to consider? Sachika.
Thank you. For question 3, I support the proposed way forward. And for question 4, I think it will be perhaps helpful to ask IASB about their experience. As an international standard setter, I think they also need to address the issue of CUSP And I think it is possible that they also have some internal drafting guide policies. And I think learning their experience would be helpful for IAASB to consider whether there is anything that can also be applied and therefore included in the drafting principles and the guideline. That's all for me. Thank you.
Zoom moved me to the second page again. Imran.
Tom, you should be happy that they haven't moved you to page 51.
They probably should. We could take a vote on that later.
Tom, when you start reading this piece of work, by the time you get to the third paragraph, you come across the word that what we're preparing is non-authoritative. And I think that's a fairly early signpost as to the status of what it is that we're doing. I really appreciate Roger's views about the risk of what we're developing into something that is more than non-authoritative later on. And of course, I call it a risk because I wouldn't want it to become more than that. And what else can we do in terms of binding it and labeling it so that this doesn't become a reference point for what really should only be residing in the ISAs permanently, and that people don't start referencing this in justifying inspection findings or justifying root causes or other things around the world. Because I understand our board's intention is that this must remain non-authoritative and not become part of the jurisprudence of our board.
Thank you. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. Due to question 3, I'm in favor of the proposed way forward. And to my reaction to question 4, I have an issue with the working definition of proportionality. In my view, there are 2 aspects of proportionality from a legal and a standard setting point of view: the proportionality of a requirement and the proportionality of its interpretation. The proportionality of a requirement is a concept intended to assist in discerning the correct balance between the severity of a measure and the behavior that the measure is designed to address. The proportionality of interpretation is a concept intended to assist in discerning the correct balance between the severity of an interpretation of a requirement in a particular instance and the behavior that the interpretation is seeking to address. Due to the time we want to save, I will provide further offline comments to the working group to explain why I believe that the working definition of proportionality in the paper is not useful and another concept should be used. Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy.
Thanks, Tom. I agree with the path forward. And then other possible considerations. What impact might digitalization have on this project? That's one. I want to reiterate the comment I made before about some sort of standback provision when we're writing standards and looking back and seeing that we've been true to the principles. And also, as it relates to the appendix, notwithstanding what Brett said, I still would like to look at some of these spectrums and the number of items in them with the thought, with the focus on performance consistency and audit quality, because that's where I am most concerned. And that ties into perhaps some targeted going back to existing standards, not to suggest that they're not excellent standards, but that perhaps the performance consistency could improve if we apply some of the changes that we plan to make going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ido?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I mentioned in the first time around that I was struggling with scalability and proportionality as well, particularly when we talk of scalability to address needs of different stakeholders. So I think I'm troubled by that, because I think we consider all stakeholders as we define our objectives and write requirements around it. So not sure that, anyway. I will send in my comments to the paper separately, such that the working group can consider those. And yeah, that's really it. But given that I mentioned that I would come back to it, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. One thing I do want to come back in on, and it's not to take issue with something Brett said, but I follow up on Wendy's comments. I do think we need to at least look at whether there's an ability to simplify the spectrum of words used, but also be conscious of the challenges, obviously, that experienced standard setters note and why we chose all those. The past there's obviously I would assume there's some logic there. So with the note that it's challenging, I do want us to look to see whether we could narrow the use of those terms myself. It was the one thing that stuck out at me when I looked at the appendix. It brought it front and center, and I recognize that it may not be possible, but as they say here, we're gonna should give it a college try. Roger, turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Again, great feedback. With that regard, I think it gives us a particular focus on our outreach going forward, Tom, with that objective in mind as to how we can streamline that list of terms that we're using. So we can use that as a form of feedback going forward. With regards coordination with the or consultation with the IASB, we have reached out to the IASB and had discussions. The staff have done that, but we will reach out again just in case. We talked about it with Tom this morning, just before this. Well, this morning my time, just before this call. And I think we might reach out again through Tom's contacts there with the IASB to see if there is anything else that we're missing. But we have tried everybody we can think of who would be writing equivalent type of standards, what we can learn from those particular types of standards. Scalability and proportionality, a number of people have raised it. Please feed it through. We will consider it. Sometimes it might be the way we write, but we want to make sure that we have covered the concepts and addressed those particular concepts. Again, please feed through those particular details. Tom, apart from that, I think, look, the feedback from the board has been great, very clear, very consistent on way forward. We will continue with that way forward. Again, what I would like to do is express my thanks to the board, to the staff who have been involved in the project and the working group, worked very hard, and actually to all the staff, because all the staff have had input into this document. And again, you know, the degree of action and support that we've got from the staff has been very much appreciated. Brett, Kalina, or Nikki, anything from your perspective that you would like some feedback on before we close? No? I'm seeing nods there. So, Tom, I think very clear, very, very consistent feedback. Thank you again to the board for all the considerations. Much appreciated. And we look forward to getting any other further comments.
Great, and thank you all, and great work. Thanks, great input from the board on the CUSP project. As people could say, this project is alive and well. People were wondering, well, LCE, where's CUSP? And clearly the CUSP team has been working very hard. We're going to close the public session of the meeting right now.